All right, in accordance with the Open Public Meetings Act, PL 1975, Chapter 231, adequate notice of this regular meeting of the Planning Board of the Township has been provided. If everyone could please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Councilman Chase,
Here.
Carl Houck,
Present.
Maher Rafiq,
Here.
Cecile McIver, Robert Metler,
Here.
Mustafa Mansray,
Yeah.
Charles Brown,
Here.
Robert Thomas, Jennifer Ragnow, and Godwin Amalola asked to be excused, and Chairman Orsini.
Here. All right, so we have, it looks as though, a number of minutes to catch up on. So we'll start with the minutes from the regular meeting of March 20th. Any comments or corrections? If not, may I have a motion? All right, I guess I'll move that they be approved.
Second.
Councilman Chase,
Yes.
Carl Houck,
Yes.
Maher Rafiq,
Yes.
Mustafa Mansray,
Yes.
Charles Brown,
Yes.
Robert Thomas, and Chairman Orsini.
Yes. Moving on, the minutes of the regular meeting from April the 3rd.
Move to approve.
Second.
Councilman Chase,
Yes.
Carl Houck, Maher Rafiq,
Yes.
Cecile McIver,
Yes.
Robert Metler,
Yes.
Mustafa Mansray,
Yes.
Charles Brown,
Yes.
Robert Thomas, and Chairman Orsini.
Yes. And lastly, the minutes from the regular meeting of April 17th. I guess I'll move those as well.
I'll second.
Councilman Chase,
Yes. She wasn't here.
who?
We hear.
Maher.
Oh, yeah, no, she wasn't, sorry.
Okay. That I will second.
Okay, Mr. Metler, thank you. Councilman Chase,
Yes.
Carl Houck,
Yes.
Robert Metler,
Yes.
Mustafa Mansray,
Yes.
and Chairman Orsini.
Yes. One resolution for 3 Ronson LLC, PLN 19-00014.
Move to approve the resolution.
Now, you weren't here, can you,
Oh, no.
no? It can only be Councilman Chase, Carl Houck, Robert Metler, Mustafa, or Chairman Orsini, just the 5 of you.
I'll move the resolution.
Thank you, Mr. Chase.
Second.
Okay, Councilman Chase,
Yes.
Carl Houck,
Yes.
Robert Metler,
Yes.
Mustafa Mansray,
Yes.
and Chairman Orsini.
Yes. Okay, going into the discussion section, I think we have Mark to tell us about the area in need of rehabilitation.
Yes, and I will give a brief overview. This is the Frank's Hardware site on Route 27, Somerset Street. The township had CME Associates prepare an evaluation of that property to determine whether it met the statutory criteria for being deemed an area in need of rehab. Just some quick overview of what that means. Basically, it would allow the area to be added to our redevelopment area. We do have an application for the redevelopment of the Frank's Hardware site into an upscale self-storage facility and a retail pad in the front. This would allow that potential redevelopment to occur. There will be, assuming this rehab designation moves forward, there will be changes to the redevelopment plan that'll come before you with concept plans. And at that point, you'll have the opportunity to discuss things like setbacks and buffers and other things that you would like to have integrated into the redevelopment plan. But that's not being discussed tonight. Tonight, it's really just I think a relatively straightforward exercise of whether this site meets the statutory criteria. Lastly, I'll say also that an area in need of rehab does not involve eminent domain. It allows it to be added to the redevelopment area, but does not have that power vested in it.
So, Mark, why does it need to be added to redevelopment to make any of this happen? Just because of the zoning?
That's a very good question. Well, 2 things. It's in the redevelopment area. self-storage is not permitted in that particular zone. This is kind of like the Wawa. If you remember we had the Wawa a few years ago with the gas station and the convenience store. That particular use wasn't permitted in that redevelopment zone. By law, you can't get a D1. They couldn't go to the zoning board for a use variance for that. By law, you can't go and get a use variance in a redevelopment area. You have to change the plan. The town felt that when they were, saw the application or the proposal for the Wawa, that would be a good addition to the redevelopment area. So we went and had to go and change the plan to allow that use. This is the same process. This is the self-storage concept has been presented to the redevelopment agency, land use committee of council. It'll be presented to you when the redevelopment plan is prepared. And the feeling again was that this would be a positive addition to the redevelopment area. So the mechanism to do it is to change the plan. The reason why we're doing the rehab is that the back portion of the site that is, well, I think the reason why this area meets the site meets the rehab criteria is basically a kind of a car junkyard. That area is actually not in the redevelopment area, so this would kind of include the entirety of the site in the redevelopment area. Then we can change the zone to permit that use.
Is it contiguous with the existing redevelopment area? Or
Yes.
Oh, it is?
Yes, the front of the site is in it. The back of the site, that's kind of a gravel car junkyard, is not.
So they couldn't do this through an application to the zoning board?
No.
Only even
You have to do it, if the town is interested in allowing this, you have to change the plan. They cannot go the route
Yeah,
of
I
the
can
use variance.
chime in. Any application for redevelopment or rehabilitation has to go to the planning board.
No,
The
but
i-
I mean, just
yeah.
for that use, like if they wanted to put a self-storage facility and they didn't have that use there, even if it wasn't in the redevelopment area, couldn't they just go to the zoning board for relief?
Well, if it wasn't in the redevelopment area, but I think what they're saying is that they're trying to utilize some of the other parcels as well, correct?
Yes.
So you've got some areas that have already been designated as an area in need of redevelopment or rehabilitation. We now want to add to that so that we can develop the entire area
see.
with that use.
So then basically-
But you can't, there's no use variances from a redevelopment plan. The only way you can do that is by going back and changing the redevelopment plan.
Gotcha, okay.
And the reason for that is, I think redevelopment is an important step for a town to take. And you don't want to designate, have a redevelopment plan, go through the effort of designating redevelopers, and then allowing people to vary from that plan by getting a use variance. So it has to go through, the town council for that to happen.
I'm clear now, thanks.
So, so that's the background, and we talked a little bit about the condition of the site. As I indicated, CME did the report. They, on page 16, about 15 pages worth of maps and evaluating the condition of the property, et cetera, providing the background. On page 16, they talk about the eligible criteria. On page 17, they indicate that it meets two of the criteria. Criteria one being that it's a significant portion of structures are in a deteriorated or substandard condition, and there's a pattern of vacancy, abandonment, and underutilization of properties in the area. So based on those two criteria, they opined that it met the criteria. The council passed a resolution on May 14th that it met the criteria. And this is similar to an ordinance, where when an ordinance gets introduced, the council, introduces the ordinance, then it has to come to the planning board for your recommendation. This is pretty much the same exact process. The council adopted the resolution. It's coming to you for your recommendation, and then they will act after that.
And obviously, the plan for this whole thing, when it gets presented to us as well, right?
Yes, you're going to be presented the concept plan, and you'll be involved in drafting, working on the redevelopment plan. And then obviously after that, the site plan.
Right,
So
that's
every
what I
last
was,
little
that's
detail,
more
you'll
what I
be
was referring
involved
to.
in both of those two future steps.
But what we're doing is approving
This is-
the addition of a self-storage unit
No,
to
no,
the.
No.
No?
What this is just saying that the condition of the property, the current condition of the property, meets the criteria for an area in need of rehabilitation. Because it's,
Theoretically, we would be blind almost to what would come after it, right? That would just be an area in need of redevelopment, and then they would come with a plan.
that's a very good way of putting it. You really, I wanted to provide you with the background, put it a little bit into context, but you really do have to separate out what may or may not come in the future. It's just, does this site meet these two criteria that the planners from CME felt it met? And again, the council made that determination. Now it's being sent to you to see if you have any comments or recommendations.
So dilapidated cars can substitute for dilapidated buildings?
I believe so. I mean, according to CME, I mean, that's their planners under their license indicated that it met those two criteria.
That might fall more under the underutilization, or, what's the other criteria? Underutilization and the general state of the property.
There is some language about that, but that condition meeting the underutilization criteria.
I don't think just because it's cars. I mean, if it was a nice car dealership, I think we wouldn't be here talking about it. So probably just the condition of the whole thing, right?
And I think the condition of some of the outbuildings, et cetera. The lack of parking relative to the amount of space occupied by the building. So that's what's before you. I did give you a draft one-page resolution.
Do we have to pass that tonight, or is that just going to the council and then coming back, or how does that work?
Well, you don't have to do anything. It's before you for you to act on it if you wish.
Well, if we wish, should we act on it tonight?
Yes,
Okay.
if you wish.
I think the optimistic goal is to have you act upon the area in need of rehabilitation, and if you vote favorably with respect to that, you then would adopt the resolution. That be
Gotcha.
correct, Mr. Healy?
Yes.
Okay.
All right. Any questions from any members of the board? From Mark?
The hardware store itself, I didn't think was dilapidated, but the other buildings, the storage, the unused storage buildings in the rear clearly are dilapidated. But we're talking about the whole site then.
Yes, they're looking at the site as a whole.
So the back lots of sort of 19 through 22, 31 through 34, will they be asking us to rezone them from R7 to redevelopment commercial?
Yes, the last few, I think 19 through 22 and 31 through 34 are in the R7 zone.
Yeah.
Like you may have already stated this, but what is gained by going through this process as opposed to the traditional process? By identifying this as an area?
Well, I'll answer the first part. I mean, what could be gained is that you're taking, I mean, the front 80% of the site is in the redevelopment area, and the purpose of the redevelopment zoning is to allow, properties that could be put to better use, to allow them to be redeveloped in a way that adds to the character of the area, that produces jobs, produces rateables, and it otherwise is a benefit to that area of the town and the area as a whole. That's the purpose. The second part of your question, I'm not quite sure
Well,
of.
the second question would be, so does the property owner come forth and say they would like to be considered? Or is this something initiated by
Well,
the township?
so that's a good question. So, the property owner is, well, as we indicated before, this is, eminent domain is not involved. So this is purely a voluntary process. The applicant is not the property owner. It's a potential developer who is seeking to buy the property from Frank's Hardware. So, you can make your, I don't know we don't ask that question of like what, but, you can assume that Frank's Hardware is looking to kind of move on. They're selling it, they want to sell the property to this potential redeveloper. And I don't know.
So hypothetically, I can drive down 27 in the redevelopment zone, see a property that I consider to be in disrepair, have a study done to prove that it may meet that criteria, and then we would grant them the same thing, is what you're saying?
Well, it's if it's something that the township the planning board and the township council feel would be beneficial to the township, that's you know, in a very general sense, that's kind of the way it works. I mean, we get proposals all the time, every single day, frankly. Somebody's coming to us saying, hey, can I do X on this property? Can I do Y on that property?
Say for
And-
state statute, what's considered beneficial from the township standpoint?
S- s-
What's considered beneficial? What makes it
I
beneficial?
I can't really answer that. I mean, that's dependent on the particular application. And then again, it goes, depending on the nature of the application, it may go to the planning board, may go to the zoning board. This situation involves the planning board and the council, and collectively, the planning board and the council decide, you know, whether this is something that they want to see, and if you do, what types of things you want to see in terms of, that's why I was mentioning before about things like setbacks and buffers and, you know, whatever requirements that when the plan comes before you, you know, you'll get to, you know, be involved in. You know, in the concept plans that we have, again, I really don't want to get too much into it, but
I mean, we're not
it's-
changing the underlying zoning. of the property,
the
right?
front, about 80%
Mhm.
is in commercial zone in the redevelopment area.
In the
back,
rear,
the back
R7.
portion where the cars are dumped, that's actually in the R7s in
Yeah.
the residential zone.
But this is not changing that zoning necessarily.
This,
is
this does not, but in the future, in the next few months,
Mhm.
you know, there'll be a draft plan prepared if it continues to move forward, and that plan would propose to rezone that back 20% or so to a commercial zone,
to match the, yeah.
to match the front.
I think I'd say, from the council's point of view, something newer, bigger, and paying more taxes is probably what you want, what justifies redevelopment. Well, if you got a junkyard, as we do a little further down 27, almost anything is better. Now, I remember when there's a sort of used car and car rental place down there, and they came in on a variance and thinking almost anything is better than what's there now. That was even before the adoption of the redevelopment zone, but it was an early example of redevelopment in the area. Now, we'd probably like to see something better.
So, yeah, and again, I wanted to provide you with a little bit of perspective of why this is. I think you do need to know why this is before you. But, you know, I think in a nutshell, whether this concept of, I mean, we're doing this because of this concept that's been presented to the township. But again, you do have to kind of separate yourself from that. This allows the potential redevelopment of that site with something better. Whether it happens at the end of the day, whether it's going to be exactly the self-storage, you may end up, you know, at the when they come forward for the plan, you may decide, you know, we want larger setbacks, we want larger buffers, and may not work out. You may not come to an agreement between, you know, the township and the potential redeveloper, and if that's what happens, that's what happens. This just allows that potential discussion to occur.
Any other questions from the board?
I have a question. So hypothetically, if this wasn't in the redevelop,
Well, it's a very complicated question. I mean, the fact, to some degree, the fact that it's in a redevelopment area, and they don't have the opportunity to just go to the zoning board, in a way makes it harder. I think if they weren't in the redevelopment area, that's what they would probably they'd be probably making an application as we speak and be going to the zoning board for a use variance application. As indicated before, because of the way the law is, that's just not an option. So it has to go before council to change the plan. But the council is not necessarily. So you know, the solution here is to change the plan rather than taking it out of the redevelopment area altogether. I think if the township was to start looking at changing the redevelopment area as a whole, you don't just do it on a site-by-site basis like that. You really want to look at it as a whole and, you know, figure out what should stay, what should go, et cetera.
And actually, it sort of gives us almost a little more control, doesn't it, to have it in the?
It does. That's one of the benefits of having a redevelopment plan is that you can get very specific. First of all, you have the ability to designate a redeveloper. You can enter into a redevelopment agreement where you can have very specific controls of how and when they build. You can have much more specific requirements in the plan than you can have compared to regular zoning. I mean, you can get down to the details of, we want this type of brick and this type of hardy plank, and we want, you can get extremely specific, much more so than regular zoning.
Mark, looking at the site, my concern, you stated the first half, or the first majority of the site is already commercially zoned. The back part where the cars are is residentially zoned. Changing it from residential to commercial is going to further penetrate into that residential neighborhood potentially. And I understand the total benefit to the city, to the municipality. I just wonder about the concern the residents would have about whatever the commercial site being further penetrating within that community. So I just wanted to point that out. With the Wawa site, at least you had a buffer of Myrtle Street. Here, you don't necessarily have that benefit. So it'll be interesting to see what comes and how we treat the buffer when it comes to how it abuts the residential properties.
But I think what it allows you to do is take a situation where my guess is that that property in the back is a pre-existing non-conforming commercial use that is in the residential zone. Would that be?
It is. I mean,
Okay.
the portion of the site that's, and I'll make a recommendation about that in a second. Yes, it is. Right now, that commercial use they've already penetrated into the residential area. They had, I think for a few decades now, the trees have been gone. It's been used as this,
What
storage.
this would allow you to do is take the site as a whole and figure out how you can redevelop the site so that you can protect that residential neighborhood and you can actually provide it with a better condition that exists already. Because right now, you can see what's out there, and it's a commercial use that I don't necessarily know that I would want abutting my residential property. So what this allows you to do is take the site as a whole, figure out what works best there, figure out what buffers are going to work, figure out how you would want the commercial zone to buffer any residential properties that it abuts, and create a better situation for what's there. That's why you would want to do that.
Well, it's a residential zone, but it's non-conforming use on that
Yes.
currently, right?
Yeah.
You could argue that you keep. That's the best way to protect the neighborhood. But I get the point. I'm not opposed. I get it. I think it's a great idea. It's a great way to move forward. My concern is just for the community to point that out and make sure during the planning process and the site planning that we protect that neighborhood.
And that is, I think, perfect wording for the suggestion I was going to make, which is, as part of this resolution, you can offer recommendations. So, I don't think I think it would be appropriate, if you wish, you could say, I mean, the resolution now basically says, now therefore be it resolved that it meets the criteria. I don't think it would be inappropriate for the board to say that this does include property that's in a residential zone, and it abuts a residential. There is one house that abuts the rear, and that in the preparation of the redevelopment plan, we're going to be seeking a sufficient buffer to protect that residential area.
You could include it. I mean, really, right now, what the board's focused on is whether or not the properties that have been identified are appropriately meet the criteria for an area in need of rehabilitation. They can provide those recommendations are really the second aspect of what's going to come before you, which is someone's going to have to come forward with an amended plan, and at the time the amended plan comes forward, you then get to look at the buffers, you get to look at what's being proposed for the development of that site. And it's at that point that you really have the most input on what's going on. I think you've given a verbal direction. If you were to adopt this, I think Mr. Healy could certainly pass along a message that when that plan gets developed, this board wants to see those residential properties appropriately buffered. But I don't know that that necessarily needs to be part of the resolution, because the resolution is really focusing on whether or not the properties themselves meet the criteria to be designated. That makes sense.
I think that makes a lot of sense, and I certainly can, I have been in communication with the potential developer and their attorney. I have actually indicated to them that buffering might be an issue, and I can let them know that during the discussion before the planning board, they made that clear that that is going to be something that they're going to look at very carefully.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
How much buffering?
What I would suggest is I would suggest we just leave it at that. Just leave it at that this is going to be something that you're concerned about and that you're going to look at carefully. You don't have the concept before you, and that's really not the purpose
Okay.
of tonight.
Okay.
You're going to get a concept plan, you're going to get renderings, you're going to get a whole bunch more information that you can use to come to a discussion, a much more informed discussion of the depth and the types of buffering.
Yep. So, like Pete suggested, I guess the first step would just be to make a motion that we recommend or agree that this is an area in need of rehabilitation, and then to vote on the resolution. So let's do that. So I'll entertain a motion that we endorse the recommendation of CME that this fits the criteria for an area in need of rehabilitation.
I'll make that motion.
Councilman Chase,
Yes.
Carl Hauck,
Yes.
Mahir Rafik,
Yes.
Cecile McIver,
Yes.
Robert Mettler,
Yes.
Mustafa Menzreh,
Yes.
Charles Brown,
Yes.
Robert Thomas, Chairman Orsini.
Yes. Now, there is a resolution before you memorializing this, and again, I could see it either way. You know, we could certainly amend the now therefore be it resolved part, and if the board feels strongly, then that's fine. Or we can leave it go through the, communication of the professionals to the redeveloper, and wait until we actually see a concrete plan. I'm fine with either one.
For what it's worth, Mr. Chairman, I have it on my to-do list already, so
Okay.
I will be contacting him.
Well, I have no doubt in your ability to follow through. It's just a question of whether the board feels comfortable with the resolution as written, or would really like to add some stronger language. And like I said, I'm fine with either one.
Since I brought it up, I feel comfortable moving forward. As
Okay.
it is. Yeah.
Okay, good. Then, in that case, I will simply need a motion to adopt the resolution that you have before you.
So moved.
Councilman Chase,
Yes.
Carl Hauck,
Yes.
Mahir Rafik,
Yes.
Cecile McIver,
Yes.
Robert Mettler,
Yes.
Mustafa Menzreh,
Yes.
Charles Brown,
Yes.
Robert Thomas, Chairman Orsini.
Yes. Okay.
Like to make schedule some sort of followed up on something in that area. You have a whole but I don't know the
Well,
see if there's support.
You're talking
Well-
about the Route 27
Yes.
corridor.
yeah, and we have a process, which is that, we started doing we're in the process of updating the master plan reexamination again that we did in 2016. So whether it's at the next meeting or the meeting in July, we're going to be discussing an updated master plan reexamination, and then after that, we're going to be working on the land use element of the master plan. re-looking at the redevelopment plan is part of that. Working with the redevelopment agency as well on that, because there are some zoning issues and plan issues that need to be addressed. I don't want to get into it now, but there are, some reasons why. There's, site constraints, I think, that have caused that situation to occur. I don't want to get into it now, but we can certainly, have that as part of the master plan that we're going to be working on into the summer and the fall.
Okay, I just wanted to see if
Yeah, it's already designated. That's, so we'd have to look at what's the better way. The designation's not the issue. It's what
make
else
it
beyond
easier
that
for
should we be doing? Yep. Yep.
All right, good point, Bob. So we'll make sure that we
That'd be one
address
of those
that
things
as
we
we
look at.
go through the master plan reexamination. So we have no hearings tonight, so we'll open to the public, and then we'll hear, I think, about our environmental resource inventory or the other parts of the master plan that you want to talk about tonight. So if I can entertain a motion to open to the public.
So moved.
Second the motion.
All in favor?
Aye.
Yeah, okay, this meeting is now open to the public for any comment on any planning matter that's not otherwise part of a hearing, which is pretty much wide open tonight because we don't have any hearings.
Mr. Chairman, seeing no one coming forward, I would move that the public hearing be closed.
Second the motion.
All in favor?
Aye.
Motion carries. Public hearing is closed. Mark, turn it back over to you.
Okay, so I'm actually going to go over three elements, draft elements of the master plan that I've been working on the last few years. I'm going to give you a very general overview of each of these. Some of them are over 100 pages in length due to the requirements imposed on these type documents. So I'm not going to go
And if
over.
we do want to read these, they're on the website, right?
So,
There's
exactly.
a folder, right?
Under the planning board, on the township website, actually you can see it on there. It's Franklin TWP and well, that's the link. But when you go to our website, there's boards and committees. Click on planning board. Then when you go to the planning board site, there's 2019 master plan. These are up there. So we gave you the link to that instead of making the 300 pages times, we kill trees and producing the environmental resource inventory. So the purpose, this is a work session. So the purpose of tonight is, I'm just going to kind of walk you through the three different documents. We're going to have future work sessions over the next weeks and months. If you have the chance to review these and you have comments at future work sessions, we can go over them. I did not expect that you all have read all 500 pages of these three documents since last week when we sent them. So the first one is the environmental resource inventory. This was initially prepared in 2008. It was prepared by Amy Green Consultants, environmental consultants, via a loan from the Association of New Jersey Environmental Commissions. I worked with the Environmental Commission. They went through the 2008 version, identified a couple pages worth of kind of bullet points of things that needed to be updated. Update this table, update that map, etc. Over a series of iterations, series of drafts, series of meetings, kind of went through and worked with the Environmental Commission to make this document as up to date as possible. It's by its name, it is what it is. It's an inventory. It doesn't make any recommendations, but it's kind of a baseline of environmental data and maps that we could use. Certainly it's intended to be used as a resource if we're looking at rezoning or open space preservation and other land use decisions. We can certainly refer to this. I'm just going to go through, since this doesn't have recommendations, I'm just going to go through the nature of the climatology, geology, soils, series of tables, series of maps, water resources, wetlands, air quality, land use changes, wildlife, threatened and endangered species, etc. And it's about 100 pages in length. I can't take credit for writing all 100 pages for sure. Again, it was originally prepared by Amy Green, and then again, working with the Environmental Commission, changing the text and tables and things to bring it up to date. I'll just scan to the back, see a bunch of pretty maps that we did. Everybody likes to look at pretty maps. But same thing, if it's on the website, if you're really bored on a Saturday afternoon when you have your laptop on your back deck, want to read through and find out something about your town, it might be worth reading. But geology, different geological formations under the ground, wellhead protection and known contaminated sites, ground recharge. I'm sure Ted could talk about this better than I can. Soils. I have no idea what a Royce soil is, but it's meaningful in some environmental way. Slopes. I mean, obviously the town is generally flat along stream corridors. There are some areas of steep slopes. Watersheds. Most significantly, it's the watersheds associated with 6 Mile Run. That's what this map shows. And C1 streams, floodplains, etc. Land use changes, 2002, 2012, and there's a text that accompanies these maps and discusses the nature of all of these different things, but using this as an example, discussing the nature of land use changes during that time frame. Preserved land, and this is current. 34% of the township's preserved. And then this is just mapping from DEP, suitable habitat for threatened and endangered species. What is this? This is wetlands, different types of wetlands, etc. So that's the ERI. Again, it's up on the website. And when you're bored, have fun. So I'll get into the two other plans. This is similar to the other ones in that I worked with the respective advisory committee. The historic preservation plan was prepared last in the township's 2006 master plan. The new plan was prepared working with the historic commission. Actually, it's not the same process. This was not an update. This was a comprehensive, completely new plan, starting from scratch. It follows the requirements of the municipal land use law, and also Sustainable Jersey, which we're participating in, and they just submitted for new certification. They have even much more stringent requirements for Sustainable Jersey, and this follows those requirements. And I think my personal opinion, I'll get into the farmland plan, which is just nuts what the requirements are. The actual requirements for Sustainable Jersey here, there are a few analyses that it makes you do that are actually pretty useful, I think. So that's the pretty cover. I'm going to skip to the inventory, which is on page 7. And I'm going to discuss the kind of the text first, and at the end I'll go and show the maps, because there's a bunch of nice-looking maps. The is comprised of our historic districts. We have a number of locally designated districts, as well as historic districts that are in the state and national register of historic sites. The DNR Canal, and again, I'll show a map that shows these different districts. Kingston Village, Kingston Mills, Griggstown, East Millstone, 6 Mile Run, which is a national historic district, Middle Bush Village, Franklin Park, Kings Highway, which I think overlaps Kingston, Rocky Hill. Then it lists individual structures that are individually listed on the National Register. So these are kind of the really important ones. Individual sites: Rockingham, Tulip Wood, 6 Mile Run Reformed Church, Van Wickle. Then there's a listing of sites and districts that are on the state and national register of historic places. These are where it says SR, that means it's on the state register. See in that fourth column there, SR, that gives the date of when they were designated. The other things, opinion means that the SHPO, which is the State Historic Preservation Office, had evaluated the sites, but they presumably have some value, but weren't put on the register. And then we have a township-wide historic resources inventory. And this is pretty interesting, this is particularly the maps that accompany it. We had an intern a number of years ago, and he basically spent the summer looking at, so on this page, this is all the different resources that we looked at. There were nomination documents, there was a county-wide historic survey, historic structure survey for East Millstone, historic structure survey for Griggstown, GIS data, township tax maps. We use all these different things to try to come up with a comprehensive inventory of all of the historic structures. And it numbered about 300. And we have maps that show all the individual locations and assign kind of a significance to them. Again, I'll get into that in a second when we look at the maps. And then we have township-owned historic resources. And those are the names. Some of those are repetitive, but some of these are the ones that are actually on township-owned property. And then lastly, in terms of the inventory, because it's related to historic preservation, are the scenic resources. So we have township-designated scenic corridors. Here they're listed. Again, there's a map that shows where they are. Millstone Valley Scenic, well, I think that's a typo. Scenic Byway. I'll have to. So this is a designation about 5 years ago, where here's the map of it. Essentially, it's Canal Road, and then what is it, River Road across the street, across the. That they're on it's a National Scenic Byway designated by the federal government. And Canal Road is a New Jersey Scenic Byway. So that, these are roadways and corridors in the township that are of national significance. And it's in here because that's where a large number of our historic structures are located. This is something that, so when I talked about Sustainable Jersey having requirements that go above and beyond what the municipal land use law had, I think this is an exercise that I think was a good exercise. It required you to look at the potential threats to historic preservation and assets that can help you with historic preservation. So I'm just going to run through these. And these were identified working with the Historic Commission. So obviously maintenance of buildings, the lack of maintenance can be a threat to historic preservation. The need for education and awareness, financial issues, if people don't have the wherewithal to maintain their historic properties and they fall into disrepair, that could certainly be a threat. Tear downs, I don't know if that's a huge issue in Franklin. I think my recollection with talking with the Historic Commission, I don't believe they thought that was a huge issue here, but it's always an issue in historic districts where somebody might want to tear.
Two proposals for tear downs in Franklin Park before the Historic Commission right now.
Oh, okay. Well, this is, when we were working on the plan, it wasn't, that was the nature of the discussion, was it doesn't happen here a lot, but there's always the potential, so it's a threat, and you just brought up that exact issue.
To add to what Ted said, the Historic Commission last night said they would like to form a subcommittee to work with you about looking at the zoning of Franklin Park and the future of that historic district, because having it zoned commercial almost leads people to buy something and tear it down for another purpose.
Okay.
And so it's a question that the Historic Commission would like to go into with you.
Okay. And then key assets. This is the strong regulatory framework. What that means is the township has, I think, a very strong historic preservation ordinance. It's been updated to comply with the Certified Local Government Program, which is very stringent and got reviewed extensively. by the state. So in terms of our regulations, they're about as strong as they can be. The presence of, our Historic Preservation Commission and its membership and the knowledge of the membership is certainly an asset. This has to be updated because this says pending certified local government, so we'll have to update that. But that provides the Historic Commission basically even more power to control and review what happens in our historic districts. The fact that we have a number of active historic preservation organizations, and they're listed here, is an asset. Meadows Foundation, we kind of point out the Meadows Foundation in particular, because I think most people know they're, the township's, long-term partnership with the Meadows Foundation and the asset that they've been over the last few decades. The township's commitment to historic preservation, the town's open space and farmland preservation programs are certainly supportive of historic preservation. A lot of the areas that are preserved also coincide. So those two things kind of go hand in hand. So that's an asset. So that's the threats and assets. The goals I won't get into. You can read that. I think they're probably what you would expect. This is another evaluation that Sustainable Jersey required. It required you to evaluate your master plan and your land and your development regulations to see if they're compatible with historic preservation. It's not required by the municipal land use law, but I think it's a good planning exercise. So we went and talked about some major themes. So let me get to that. Sorry for jumping around. So bottom of page 24, just generally some major themes that run through the master plan, the open space plan, the farmland preservation plan, and our zoning that are all compatible with historic preservation. Keeping rural areas rural, preserving areas of scenic and historic value, preserving the historic villages, preserving a buffer around historic hamlets, and using non-zoning techniques such as not extending water and sewer into areas that are currently not developed. All of those planning and zoning techniques and mechanisms are supportive and consistent with historic preservation. It talks about the portions of the township that are rural, the A zone, which is 6-acre zoning, the canal preservation zone, which was set up specifically to protect the area that kind of goes along the canal, and the rural residential 5, which is 5-acre zoning, rural residential 3, which is 3-acre zoning. All of those, that zoning is all, again, compatible with preserving the rural character of that area of the town and historic preservation. And then it also talks about what they call innovative planning techniques that we do employ here: lot size averaging, cluster zoning, which has resulted in hundreds of acres being preserved in Franklin Township, including some historic properties. And then lastly, I'll go through these are the recommendations. So they want to complete the township-wide inventory. The inventory was prepared. The Historic Commission kind of started to look at it, but they want to get deeper into it. So that's something that they put in as something that they want to finish. Evaluating historic district boundaries and consider designation of individual structures. So there has been talk about at the Historic Commission about whether certain of the historic districts could be expanded, whether they maybe could be taken back a little bit, and using that historic, the inventory to kind of guide that. If there is an area that is in a historic district, but there really aren't any historic structures there, well, maybe we can take that back. Or if there's some where the boundaries maybe don't pick up a few, maybe we should expand it. Or if there's some individual sites that aren't in districts, we can change the ordinance and individually add them. So that's what that's about. Continuing to implement the village protection program. So this is the green belts around the historic hamlets. I think we talked about that with a lot of these different plans. This kind of common themes run throughout. I think we talked about this with it's talked about in the in the farmland plan, as well as in our open space plan that try to have open space around our historic villages. Education, obviously I think that goes without saying what that means, educating people about historic preservation, promoting rehabilitation. It talks about some possibility of some programs for that, pursuing funding opportunities. I'll skip down to 8, fostering partnerships. I mentioned Meadows and the other historic groups in and around Franklin. Number 9, this is really again, kind of straight up planning thing, keeping rural areas rural and maintaining the development patterns in historic villages. And what that really means is, so for example, East Millstone is R10, quarter-acre zoning. If the township was to go in and half cut the lot area in half, well, that might encourage people to go in, subdivide. That may cause properties to be cause the demolition of homes, so they can put up 2 new homes. So basically, it was thought that the existing zoning in the existing hamlets met the existing pattern and density of those historic hamlets, so we should keep it that way. That was that recommendation. So that's the historic element. Any questions or comments on that?
Anything about the economic implications of certain communities. We can consider the positive benefit of something historic.
Well, meaning if a property was designated historic.
Right.
Well, that is an issue. I know that when towns have designated areas as historic, that can be an extremely controversial political issue, because people are concerned now that they have less control of their own property. And I think the canned answer for that is we'll have to address it if and when that occurs. At this point, this plan does not make any recommendations about that. But just basically says, we have this inventory, and we should go through the exercise of evaluating whether we should expand or contract. But it doesn't say at this point, this area should be designated, this area should, be taken off. It just says we need to go through and do that exercise at some point.
Nor did it recommend like a criteria for that process.
Whether this plan does, that there are criteria.
Great.
Oh, you can't. No, it's in the statute. You can't just designate an area because you feel it. There has to be a study done, and there's I think it's a municipal land use law of what criteria needs to be met to. So I'll just because they're nice maps. So this is state and national historic districts. Might be the big area in the middle there is that's in that gold color. That's the 6 Mile Run Historic District. And the rest is kind of on the periphery, along the canal and then going down Canal Road. So you can see the Griggstown. On the bottom there is Kingston. And these are that's the state and national. This is the township designated historic district. So these are the areas where if this is control where if you're doing development, making a change to your home, building something, you have to go to our historic commission for their review. So that's Middlebush, East Millstone, Franklin Park, and Kingston, and then anything within 1,000 feet of the canal. So that's the properties that are in that tan color. And then we also show in green, which is not a historic, these are the scenic corridors. So these are the more, I think you might not be surprised by the names of the roads that are designated as, Skillman's, Cordeloo, Saddam, Butler, Grouser, the more narrow, Old Georgetown, Copper Mine. And then this is the historic resource. So this is the township-wide map of individual properties that were identified, and whether they were, the different colors mean whether they were identified as, the green means it's state and national register, so those are the really important ones. Yellow is contributing, meaning it's in a historic district and it was identified as contributing to that district. So these were properties that had historic value, and collectively, because of these contributing structures, that area was qualified as a historic district. And then we go and then we go individual areas, property by property, number them, and then there's tables in the back that identify every single property and talks about their attributes. So that's so I think, as opposed to the ERI, which is very dense, very technical, I think this is perhaps more interesting reading. So I definitely encourage you to read it at your convenience. And then this is the tables that accompany it. You can see that, that's the number 29. It's contributing. Then they gave it a name, the address, the block and lot, and then sometimes there's notes about, it's now a restaurant identified in 1876 as the House of Sivan. So there's a little bit of background to it. Any other questions on that? Okay. So I'll move to the farmland preservation plan. Mm-hmm. Try to answer it. Go ahead. Mm-hmm. Yep. Let me see. I'm going to go ahead and guess that if it was, it'd be a contributing structure on the 6 Mile Run Historic District, if it's going to be listed at all. Mm-hmm.
Building looks like it's falling.
I think it's either, looking at the map, it's hard to, I'd have to look at the, a better blow up of the map, but I think it's either 178, 179, or 180. It's not 180, that's the graveyard next to it.
It is turning out. We can take a look at in 4.
I think it's 179, so it's identified as a contributing structure. Yeah, I think part of the problem is that they didn't pursue it. If they were building the structure, if they were implementing their plan, we would be making them, maintain it. That approval was about 10 years ago.
Right,
and they haven't
the
done.
outside was conditioned.
Yeah. Yeah, it's 170. It's structure 170. So it says it's converted to storehouse use earlier in this century. So I'm almost certain 179 is that. we can talk about that after. Okay, so the farmland preservation plan. This has been, I'm going to try to describe in about 5-10 minutes what has taken more than 10 years to do. This is now the third version of this plan. The State Agricultural Development Committee, SADC, has extremely detailed requirements for a plan. And so, again, this is now the third iteration, or third version that we're trying to get past. This version we submitted to their staff a number of months ago. They had some comments. We've incorporated their comments. So we're now very confident that we finally have met their requirements. It's a 110-page document created from scratch, most of which I did, but it's one of those things where you ask me what that means. I was in a fugue state, I think, while preparing it. So I'm going to go through the things that I do understand, and I think the things that are actually important, because there's a lot of fluff, a lot of background, how many blueberries were harvested in 1972 versus 1984, things like that. So I'm going to go over things that matter, like the inventory, the targeted farms, things like that. What are the farms that we want preserved? Where are they? Things like that. That's the important stuff. So, again, I'll go over the inventory real quick. The inventory is consists of preserved farms, which I think goes without saying. Here's the inventory. So the preserved farms are in that light pink, and they total 1,224 acres. The next is open space leased for farming, and that is the tan color. So a lot of those are, it's some township property, some on county open space. The majority is on the 6 Mile Run. So those are, again, owned by either the county, the state, or the township, and then they're leased to farmers. That's about 2,500 acres. We have farm assessed properties, which are another 3,800. That's the purple. And then there's two farms owned by Rutgers. They're about 100 acres. So altogether, we have about almost 7,700 acres of farming. That's about 30% of the town is actually still falls under one of those categories. That's the inventory of. So I think bottom line is farming is still here, and the purpose of the plan is to preserve it. I'm going to skip all the way down to page 30. These are tables that accompany that map. So table 1 is preserved farms. Table 2 is open space leased for farming. Table 3 is farm assessed. Goes on for pages after pages. This part talks about farmland soils. It's just interesting to note that 93% of the town has farmland capable soils. And there's a map that shows, so that's basically the dark green, basically all the greens, but basically the darker the green, the better the soils. So a large portion of the township is very suitable for soils. Very suitable for farming. I'm going to go over. I'm just going to point you to, because I think if you want to read this, again, a lot of this is not very useful from a planning perspective as the planning board. If you are going to read it, I would suggest looking at the inventory and looking at starting on page 30 through I think 44. There's a discussion of the land use planning context. So this is, I think, one of the useful things that it asks you to do. again, you look at your master plan, you look at your development regulations, you look at your, the different components of your master plan, your historic element, your open space plan, et cetera. How is it compatible with farmland preservation? And this analysis goes through, similar analysis that was done with the historic, the rural, the rural compatible zoning, the low density, the A zone, the canal preservation, et cetera, the cluster zoning, keeping the water and sewer out of areas that are currently that are rural and being farmed. All of those different things are compatible with farmland preservation.
We also still have a right to farm ordinance.
There's a right. It talks about that. It talks about how the right to farm ordinance certainly is compatible with farming. The scenic corridor. So basically, any scenic corridor protection ordinance, anything along those lines, all of those are compatible with kind of the suite of tools that are compatible with farmland preservation. So that's pages. Again, I would suggest you're going to look at that section. I think it is somewhat informative, not just for farmland preservation, but just overall the master plan. There could be some good information in there. And then I'm going to skip down to page 44. So I'm just going to point to that. So this is a map that shows the blue are the targeted farms. And it's kind of hard to see at this scale, but I'll just go to the map. What this is showing is that, so these are the blue are the targeted farms, and what it's showing is that this is the A zone, so this is the agricultural zone with 6-acre zoning. This is RR5 and RR3, again, 3-acre, 5-acre zoning, and this is the canal preservation zone. So that it's basically showing that we want to preserve the farms. We're targeting farms for preservation in our rural areas. There is some in here that are in the R40 zone, but that's something that they want to see. I mean, if you generally don't want to preserve farms that are zoned for industrial. The land values would be way too significant, and there's certain areas that you want to have for industrial growth, certain areas of town that you want to have rural preservation and farmland preservation. That's what this basically is demonstrating. And then the same thing we've talked about, water and sewer. This is the same thing. The pink is areas that are in the sewer service area. The blue is water service, and you see the areas that are white are in neither. So basically these are the areas that are well septic, the more rural, less densely developed areas of the town. And those targeted farms were prepared and identified working with I should have mentioned in the beginning, just like the Historic Commission on the Historic Plan, Environmental Commission on Environmental, this was done with input from the Agricultural Advisory Committee. And I should also mention that Tara Kenyon, who's our open space consultant, kind of came in at the end here and helped bring some of the, I couldn't find out, I shouldn't downplay because it just is almost a joke, because she gave good contributions to bring this over the finish line. But I like to say, how the heck do you find out how many blueberries were harvested in 1972? She knew that stuff and was able to find it in a second. That's a silly example, but she had other ways to bring this to the finish line, so I'll give her credit for that. Well, and that's basically it. That pages 47 through 110. Have at it. It's a lot of filler. Again, the main substance of it is the identification of the targeted farms, demonstrating their location. There is a spending plan in there. The plan is on a 10-year horizon, so it basically assumes, I think extremely unlikely, that all the targeted farms would be acquired in a 10-year period, but you kind of do that in the context of this plan, since it's a 10-year plan. You identify what the potential costs are, and then there's assumptions based on how these different programs work, of how much there's always partnering with the county and the state, how much would most likely be the township share, the county share, and the state share to acquire the properties that are targeted.
Yeah, it might be well to say that with this, some of it is not really the purchase of the land, but the purchase of the development rights of the land.
Yeah, I should have stated that from the beginning, because that's actually the key. That's how farmland preservation works. Is that the farmer they continue to own the land, the township or the county or the state or the state, I should say. There's an assessment, an appraisal of the property to determine the development value. I think it's usually like in the neighborhood of 60 to 80%. They receive that 60 to 80% of the value of their land. Then there's a permanent easement, farmland preservation easement that's placed over the property. They continue to own it, but they can own in perpetuity in exchange for, frankly, the money they receive for that value. It can only be farmed in perpetuity. So that's basically that plan. Again, I think there is some useful stuff in there. I think some of the inventory stuff, some of the there are some mechanisms for. I just happen to be on here. Easement purchases and the different type of mechanisms that can be used and different programs that can be used to fund. You may find that informational. Those are the three that I have before you tonight. I think the plan would be to have a public hearing at some point on those three, just to kind of get them done and out of the way. In the meantime, again, we'll be working on the reexamination of the land use plan, and we'll be bringing in the circulation element as well.
Good. Excuse me. So, I don't know if, Bob, you want to bring back this topic of the Laird property for a few minutes.
We basically got out of,
Your mic on? I don't know.
It's not.
I was able to get it out on the table where Mark was understanding what I'm perceiving the problem. The property's deteriorating. It's supposed to have been preserved. That's a condition of the approval that it got. And then I agree. The problem is it's never been developed. This is possibly a case where there were so many conditions placed on the approval, this developer decided they probably couldn't make it work. There are a couple of buildings on the property. The remaining buildings were in such bad shape, they weren't part of preservation part of the property. I wasn't sure before this all came out tonight if the property was on any designated list, but I remember very clearly the testimony that this was, number one, at one time, until they ended it, when the approval came, the oldest continuous run business in New Jersey. Second thing, 1827 started.
So it's likely, and I think you brought this up, that if they haven't developed it by now, the chances of us getting them to honor the preservation of the store in the absence of any development, as Pete brought this up to me, is probably unlikely. So then the cool mechanism would be what mechanism do we have, if any, to either raise that level of historic preservation designation to a level where it gets somebody's attention, or if the town can do something about it. I mean, I think like the quarry stone houses, right? They were never rehabilitated, but they were at least mothballed.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if there's a mothballing that can be done to this. I mean, but what I'm saying is there might be some options where we can escalate the issue, because that would seem to be, and I'm sure Bob Metler knows a lot more than I do, but I remember when I moved into the township, that building was still being actively used. Not very much was going on, but somebody was there doing something, maintaining it. And then as the years went by, that ceased. So.
Mark, a question. I assume that the approval that they got has lapsed, or have they been keeping it up?
What's for sale? It's been for, something must be.
Yeah,
I was going to say, at this point, I think at one point I may have been covering the Zoning Board of Adjustment when Pat Bradshaw was the attorney, and they came in for an extension of the approval. But I think at this point, it's probably I don't know. Well, variance approvals will have a period that they expire if a municipality has an ordinance that says they do. They don't. The municipal land use law doesn't make them expire by their own operation. The same thing is similar with a site plan approval. A site plan approval doesn't ever expire. What expires are the protections against someone coming in and changing the regulations on the property that you've gotten the approval for. So if they've got a site plan approval, it could still conceivably be valid. If they have variance approvals and the township has an ordinance that says you have to build a variance within X years or else your variance approval expires, that could conceivably be operating to have their variance approval expire.
and I think from a practical perspective, I'm not sure it matters because I think Bob pointed out the fact that approval was so very specific. I mean, over the years, we have had people come in for that property, and we've pointed out, okay, well, if they come in, they think they can just build a 7-Eleven. Oh, it got approved for commercial. I'm like, oh, no. You need to look at the resolution, look at the plans, look at the architecturals, because if you do anything different than exactly these plans, you're going back to the board. And we never heard from anybody after that, because it's very specific as far as the architecture, what they can sell, what it's because of, I think, the site that it's on.
So, I mean, we should try to look into that and get a little more information, because it is a very visible, very fair. I mean, if I knew about it, and I'm certainly no historic maven, this is other people do as well. I'd like to see if we can gather some more information. Not as part of this, but just as a planning board exercise to see, or a zoning board exercise, Bob, if it's under your purview, we can find out a little bit more about, are there expirations on it, and if there are, and we can rezone it, something that, where they don't have the protections anymore, or can we designate the historic designation? Those would all be means that one could potentially address the problem, but I don't know which would work, if any. But at any rate, thanks for bringing that up. I mean, that's part of what we do. So, any questions for Mark on any of these plans? I would say that, if you can, before the public hearing, when would we envision having a public hearing on these three elements of the master plan?
Well, I mean, the soonest would be sometime in July.
Okay. Because we do have our typical August break, I think, and it might be good to get these out of the way before that happens.
Yep.
So, I mean, maybe just go read, or at least familiarize oneself with over cold beer on your deck or whatever, the salient parts of the plan that Mark pointed out, and not the whole 110 pages, because I can tell you right now I won't do that, but I will familiarize myself with the parts you pointed out.
Historic elements, by far the most easy read, I think.
Start with that first.
Start with that one first.
All right. Anything else? If not, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
And seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Have a good night.
I didn't ask this because I probably am not allowed to ask, but does the owner